The knots that remember. Imagine a bundle of cords. A single thick strand, perhaps a meter long, lies horizontal, and from it hang dozens of thinner strings, like the fringe of a shawl or the tendrils of some soft sea creature dried and stilled. Along each hanging cord are knots, tied at intervals, some simple, some long and ribbed with many turns, some folded into the small, tight figure of an 8. The strings are dyed in colors that have faded over 5 centuries into browns and ochres, and the gray of old wool, though here and there a deep red or a blue still holds. To the eye it looks like nothing so much as a tangle, a thing a cat has been at, or the abandoned beginning of a weaving. And yet this object is a document. It was meant to be read. Somewhere in the spacing of those knots and the twist of those threads is information, set down deliberately by a person who expected another person to recover it. This is a Khipu, sometimes spelled Quipu, the knotted cord record of the Inca, and for most of the last 500 years, no living human being has been able to read one. Tonight, I want to tell you the long, patient, and still unfinished story of how people have tried. It is a story about counting and about memory, about an empire that ran itself on string, and about the strange position of a writing that may or may not be writing. It has no tidy ending, which is part of why I love it. But let us begin where the silence begins, with the moment the cords went quiet. When the Spanish arrived in the Andes in the 1530s, they found an empire of astonishing reach. The Inca state, which called itself Tahuantinsuyu, the 4 parts together, stretched along the spine of South America for some 4,000 kilometers, from what is now Colombia down through Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia, and into Chile and Argentina. It governed perhaps 10 or 12 million people. It moved armies, collected tribute, stored grain against famine, resettled whole populations, and maintained a road network longer than the Roman one. And it did all of this without anything the Europeans recognized as writing. There were no inscriptions, no books, no clay tablets, no painted glyphs of the kind the Spanish would later find among the Maya far to the north. Instead, there were the cords, and there were the men who kept them. These men were called Quipucamayuk, which means something like the knot maker, or the one who animates the knots. They were specialists, trained from youth, and they served as the accountants and archivists of the empire. When a Spanish official wanted to know how many tributaries lived in a given valley, or how much maize was held in a particular storehouse, a Quipucamayuk would run his fingers along the cords and read off the answer. The Spanish were impressed and also unnerved. They noticed that the cord keepers could recover not only numbers, but apparently narratives, that a Khipu could be made to yield the account of a reign, the verses of a song, the details of a lawsuit. One chronicler described watching a Quipucamayuk recite the entire history of the conquest from a single bundle of strings, weeping as he came to the parts that grieved him. But the Spanish were also colonizers, and colonizers are rarely comfortable with a record they cannot themselves read. During the campaigns to extirpate native religion, churchmen came to see the Khipu as a dangerous thing, a pagan technology that held memories the church would rather erase. In 1583, the Third Council of Lima ordered that quipus be destroyed as idolatrous objects. How many were burned, we will never know. What we do know is that the chain of teaching, the passing of the skill from one generation of Quipucamayuk to the next, was broken. Within a few generations, the knowledge was gone. The cords remained, in graves and bundles and eventually in museum drawers, but the people who could read them did not. The Khipu became a sealed letter, addressed to no one, in a script that had no Rosetta Stone. For a long time, that is where matters rested. Europeans who encountered quipus treated them as curiosities, as primitive abacuses, as the quaint counting toys of a vanished people. It was not until the early 20th century that anyone made real progress, and the breakthrough, when it came, was numerical. The man who made it was named Leland Locke. He was not a famous archaeologist or a daring explorer. He was a Brooklyn school teacher, a historian of mathematics, a collector of old calculating instruments, the kind of careful and slightly obsessive person on whom the quiet advances of scholarship so often depend. Around 1909, while studying under a historian of mathematics at Columbia, Locke became fascinated by the Khipu, and for more than a decade, he commuted into Manhattan to the American Museum of Natural History, where he measured and drew and cataloged the chords, building up a working sample of more than 40 specimens. He was looking for a pattern, and in 1912 he found one and published it. What Locke saw was that the knots were arranged by place value. Picture one of those hanging chords. Near the bottom, far from the main strand, you find the ones, the units. A little higher up, the tens. Higher still, the hundreds, then the thousands, each decimal place occupying its own zone along the length of the string. And the type of knot tells you which place you are in. In the unit's position, you find a long knot, a knot made by wrapping the cord around itself several times before pulling it through, and the number of turns gives the digit. So a long knot of 4 turns means 4, of 7 turns means 7. For the number 1 in the unit's place, there is a special form, a little figure-8 knot, because you cannot make a long knot of only 1 turn. And in all the higher positions, the tens and hundreds and beyond, you find simple overhand knots, clustered in groups, so that 3 simple knots in the hundreds zone mean 300. There is even a way to write 0, which is simply the absence of any knot in that position, a meaningful gap, a held silence in the right place along the chord. This was a genuine decipherment, and it was elegant. It meant that the Inca had a fully decimal, place value number system, the same deep idea that underlies our own arithmetic, expressed not in ink but in the topology of knots. A Khipu chord reading 2035 would show 2 simple knots up near the main strand in the thousands place, then a gap where the hundreds would be, then 3 simple knots in the tens, and finally a long knot of 5 turns at the bottom for the units. Read from the top down, it spelled out the number, place by place, exactly as a child today learns to read the columns of a figure. And there were further refinements that Locke and those who came after him worked out. Often a Khipu would have what is called a top chord, an extra string that gathered the others, and the number on the top chord was the sum of the pendant chords hanging below it, so that the object was not just a list but a little spreadsheet with totals and subtotals, with categories rolled up into grand categories. The Inca were running their empire, it turned out, on something not so far from a database. So by the middle of the 20th century, 1/2 of the mystery seemed solved. The Khipu was, at least in large part, a numerical recording device, a way of writing numbers with string. Locke himself believed it was purely that, a tool for keeping accounts and nothing more, and that the stories of Khippus holding songs and histories were either exaggerations or, at most, cases where the numbers served as a mnemonic, a set of pegs on which a trained memory could hang a narrative it already knew. On this reading, the weeping Khipu was not reading a history off the chords the way you read a sentence off a page. He was using the chords as a prompt, the way a singer might use the first words of each verse to recall the rest. But not everyone was satisfied, and this is where the story opens out into the controversy that animates it still. Because if you actually examine a large collection of Khippus, you find that only some of them are obviously numerical. Many chords carry knots that fit the decimal pattern beautifully. But there are also features that the numbers alone do not explain. There is color, an enormous range of it, and the colors are clearly doing something, but what? There is the direction in which a chord is spun and plied, clockwise or counterclockwise, a choice the maker had to make for every single string, and which the eye barely registers but the fingers can feel. There is the way a pendant is attached to the main chord, whether it is tied on so that the attachment faces toward you or away. There is the choice of fiber, cotton or the wool of camelids, llama and alpaca, and the wild vicuña. None of these things is captured by saying a chord means 412. Each of them is a degree of freedom, a place where the maker could have chosen otherwise, and in information theory, a choice that could have gone another way is exactly where information can hide. The scholar who pushed this insight furthest is Gary Ertnen, an anthropologist who for many years held a chair in Precolumbian studies at Harvard. Beginning in 2002, Ertnen and his colleague, Carrie Brezine, set out to do something that earlier Khipu researchers, working alone with notebooks, could never manage. They built a database. They gathered the measurements of every Khipu they could get access to, every chord, every knot, every color and twist and attachment, and they encoded all of it so that a computer could search for patterns across hundreds of objects at once. This was the Khipu database project, and it changed the scale of the question. For the first time, you could ask whether a particular combination of color and knot that appeared on a chord in one museum also appeared on a chord in another, a continent away, and get an answer. Ertnen also proposed a bold theoretical frame. He suggested that the Khipu was best understood not as numbers, and not as an alphabet, but as a kind of binary code. At each step of making a Khipu, he pointed out, the maker faced a series of either-or choices. Cotton or wool. Spun to the left or to the right. Not tied this way or that. Pendant attached facing front or back. Ertnen counted around 7 such inherently binary decisions, and he noted that 7 binary choices, 7 bits, can in principle encode 128 distinct possibilities, and that once you fold in the 24 or so distinguishable colors, the number of possible distinct chord signs climbs into the thousands. That is a signary large enough, in principle, to do real linguistic work, comparable to the number of signs in some of the writing systems of the ancient world. Ertnen was careful. He did not claim to have read a Khipu as language. What he claimed was that the Khipu had the structural capacity to carry language, that the information was there in the chords if only we could learn to extract it. It was an argument about possibility, and it reframed the whole field. The question was no longer simply, what do the numbers say? It was whether, alongside the numbers, the chords also held words. For a while, the field had this grand architecture, but few concrete reads. Then, in the 2010s, the breakthroughs began to come, and they came in part from an unexpected direction, from a young man who was, at the time, an undergraduate. His name is Manuel Medrano, and as a Harvard student, he began working with Ertnen's database. Medrano was interested in a particular set of quipus from the Santa River Valley on the coast of Peru, 6 chords that had survived together. And he had an idea that turned out to be powerful. He went looking in the Spanish colonial archives for a written document that might correspond to those chords. He found one, a census, what the Spanish called a revisita, a revisit conducted in 1670 in the settlements around a coastal town. The census listed the local people organized into 6 social units, and it named, one by one, 132 tributaries, the heads of households who owed labor and goods to the colonial state. 6 units in the document, 6 quipus in his hands. Medrano began to compare them. What he found was that the structure of the chords matched the structure of the census. The way each pendant was tied onto the main chord, the direction of its attachment, seemed to correspond to the social rank of the person it recorded. And then there was the matter of color. Medrano noticed that the colors of the strings appeared to track the first names of the people listed. A man named with a certain Andean name was recorded, it seemed, with a chord of a certain color, the same association repeating down the list. This was the first time anyone had read information off the way a chord was attached to the Khipu. The first time the silent choices of attachment and color had been made to speak in concert with a known list of human beings. It did not crack the whole code, but it was a handhold, a place where the chords touched the documentary record closely enough that meaning leaked across. A college student, working with a database and a colonial census and a great deal of patience, had pulled two strands of evidence together and found that they agreed. And then there is the work of Sabine Hyland, an anthropologist at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, whose discoveries have pushed hardest on the boundary between record and writing. In 2017, Hyland reported on two extraordinary quipus kept in the village of San Juan de Colada. High in the Peruvian Andes, objects the community had guarded for generations and which she was permitted to examine. These were not ancient. They were made in the 18th century, long after the conquest, and according to the village's own tradition, they were epistles, letters, exchanged between local leaders during a regional revolt against Spanish authority. If that tradition was right, these were not accounts at all. They were messages, narrative messages written in chord. Hyland examined them closely, and she counted the distinct kinds of chord sign, the unique combinations of color and fiber and direction. She arrived at 95. 95 distinct symbols. That number is significant because it falls within the range of what writing systems use when they are what scholars call logosyllabic, systems that mix signs for whole words with signs for syllables, the kind of writing used in ancient Mesopotamia and in Maya inscriptions and in the script of Imperial China. A system with only a handful of signs is probably just numbers. A system with thousands might be purely pictographic. But a system with somewhere around 100 signs is in the sweet spot for encoding the sounds of a spoken language. And Hyland did something that no one had managed before. Working from the village tradition that these were letters between particular lineages, and applying the classic techniques of decipherment, the same logic used to crack ancient scripts, she argued that the final chords of each quipu spelled out, phonetically, the names of the lineages that had sent them. She read, in other words, two words. Two proper names, in sound, off the knots. They remain the only quipus anyone has identified as phonetic, and whether the same system extends to other quipus, and especially to the older ones from Inca times, is exactly the open question. But for the first time, the chords had yielded not a quantity, but a name, not how many, but who. I find it worth pausing on how strange and beautiful this whole problem is. We are used to thinking of writing as marks on a surface, a two-dimensional affair, ink laid on a plane. The quipu is not like that. It is three-dimensional, and more than that, it is tactile. Some of its information lives in features you cannot see at all, only feel, the direction of a ply, the front or back of an attachment. A Khipu may have read partly with the fingers, the way a person reads Braille, the meaning rising through the skin. And the chords hang and sway and can be rehandled, gathered, compared, a top chord lifted to bring its pendants together. It is a writing you hold in the hand, that moves, that has weight. When we ask whether it is really writing, part of what we are bumping against is the narrowness of our own definition. Shaped as it is by a few thousand years of pressing styluses into clay and dragging pens across paper. The quipu asks us whether a system has to look like our writing to do the work of writing, to carry language across distance and time from one mind to another. Which brings me, finally, to the most recent turn in the story, and the one that I think is the loveliest, because it does not decipher a single knot, and yet it changes everything. In 2025, Sabine Hyland and her colleagues published a study not of what a quipu says, but of what it is made of. They took a quipu whose primary chord was made, unusually, of human hair, and they subjected that hair to isotope analysis. This is a technique borrowed from archaeological chemistry. As hair grows, it incorporates the chemical signatures of what a person eats and drinks, and those signatures, the ratios of certain forms of carbon and nitrogen and sulfur, can be read out to reconstruct a diet. Maize leaves one trace, tubers and greens another, meat another, food from the sea another still. Hair grows slowly and steadily, so a long lock is a slow tape recording of a life, a few centimeters per year. And this Khipu's hair cord was long, more than a meter, years of growth preserved in a single strand. The colonial Spanish had told us, again and again, that the Khipu was the instrument of an elite, that only the trained Khipukameok, high-status men in the service of the state, made and kept the cords. And here was a Khipu whose maker had, quite literally, given their own hair to the object, and whose hair revealed a diet of tubers and greens, the plain highland food of a commoner, not the maize and meat diet of the privileged. Someone ordinary, someone who worked the cold, high fields of the southern Andes around the year 1500, had made this record. The implication is quiet, but it overturns the colonial assumption. Khipu literacy was not the closely held secret of a bureaucratic caste. It reached, at least sometimes, into the lives of ordinary people. The skill of the cords was more widely held, more woven into the fabric of Andean life, than the conquerors ever let on, or perhaps ever knew. And so we arrive, as we always do with the Khipu, not at an answer but at a deepened question. We can read the numbers with confidence. We have, in 2 villages and 1 colonial census, the faint beginnings of reading something more: a social rank, a first name, the sound of a lineage. We have a theoretical account of how words could in principle live in the cords. And we have now evidence that the people who made these things were more various, more numerous, more ordinary than we believed. What we do not have is fluency. No one alive can pick up an Inca Khipu and read it the way you are listening to these words. The chain was broken in the 16th century, and it has never been repaired, only, here and there, painstakingly spliced. There is something consoling in that, I think, as you lie here in the dark. These cords have kept their secrets for 500 years, and they are in no hurry to give them up, and yet they have not been lost either. They wait in their drawers and their reliquaries and their villages, holding whatever they hold, patient as only objects can be. A school teacher from Brooklyn found the numbers in them. A college student matched them to a census of the dead. A scholar in Scotland read 2 names off their knots, and then, years later, read a commoner's whole diet out of a single strand of hair. Each of these people gave the cords a little of their attention, and the cords gave a little back. The knots remember. They are still remembering now, in the quiet, whether or not anyone is there to read them. And the rest of what they know they will tell us slowly, one patient strand at a time, on some night that has not yet come.